hoy tenemos una estructura, por así decirlo, un poco diferente, ¿no?, de las sesiones, porque haremos la pausa a una hora diferente, es decir, ahora haremos, Amber hará su charla, después tendremos una mesa redonda sobre fotoperiodismo, ¿no?, muy centrada en el fotoperiodismo, yo creo que con el privilegio de tener a Dani Duc y Pedro Ballín, moderada por Ana Aitana Fernández y por Manuel Garín, al que ya estoy viendo aquí. Después haremos la pausa, que será más temprana que ayer, y seguidamente entraremos en la charla de Ariel Aisha Zulay, la mesa de comunicaciones, y cerraremos el congreso hoy con Stephen Eisenman. Yo creo un poco volveremos a hacer el viaje que hicimos ayer, desde las fuentes, desde el mito, desde lo arcaico de las imágenes, hasta la disección de las imágenes más contemporáneas, ¿no? Y ese es un poco el viaje que os proponemos a continuación. Entonces, bueno, voy a presentar muy brevemente y de manera formal, o intentando que sea formal, a Amber. Amber, welcome and thank you very much. It's a good privilege for us that you can open this second final day of the conference. And we want to thank you in advance for your talk. And if you allow me, I would like to introduce you in a formal way. Dr. Amber Jacobs' research background is in literature, feminism, psychoanalysis, ancient Greek myth and tragedy. Her monograph, I would like to underline her fascinating monograph on matricide, myth, psychoanalysis, and the law of the mother is an intervention into classical psychoanalysis via structural anthropology and feminist philosophy that posits a new post-patriarchal theory of the symbolic order. Dr. Jacobs has published articles, a lot of articles, on psychoanalytic feminism and the mother-daughter relation in cinema, literature, and feminist thought. And her current work involves rereadings and expansions of psychoanalytic theories to accommodate new forms of subjectivities in the context of the social, cultural, and technological change. Her recent research is in visual culture, digital technologies, film theories, the relation between new media technologies and unconscious fantasy, and theories of feminist and queer spectatorship that challenge dominant psychoanalytic models of the gaze and sexual difference. And she's also interested in the analysis of formal techniques in filmmaking that reward the relation between the image and power, and in making her own films. Her ongoing and mesmerizing project, Telling Tales, that's the name of Dr. Jacobs' YouTube channel. I will share with all of you the address, which is part of the Museum of the Dream Project. Is not only an exploration of the myth, but also about power, politics, and archetypical content. What seems to be a response, if you allow me to say that, Amber, to Walter Benjamin's idea that, and this is a quotation I'm translating right now, so I don't know if it will be very effective, but Benjamin said that the story of the dream has not yet been written, opening dreams to their understanding would mean to deal a decisive blow to the superstition of naturalistic prejudice through historical illumination. Dreaming, said Benjamin, is part of history. So for me, this could be the beginning of your talk, Amber. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for your participation and your generosity. I know that it's not easy for you to be here with us because you are very busy, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the really great introduction and for inviting me. I'm really privileged to be with you. So I'm going to be talking about a current project. Can you hear? Is everything okay? Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. So just a little bit to contextualize the situation of what I'm doing at the moment. My work is around myths, but not as a classicist. And I think that's quite important to say, that I come from a context of a department called psychosocial studies. And that, I don't know in Spain if you have psychosocial studies, but what we're trying to do is to think about the sort of interface between the internal forces of the unconscious and the external material forces, and how they, I mean, I suppose everyone in cultural studies is to a certain extent kind of doing that. But I'm thinking specifically about myths as a mechanism and a form of transmission that is essentially psychosocial. And that means that's so if we just think, sorry, I'm just going to change the way the screen is. Sorry. Yeah, okay, that's better. If we just go to an obvious example of the way in which psychoanalysis, which I'm not going to talk about that much today, I'm afraid, even though I've placed it quite centrally, it is quite central to my work, but it informs what I'm going to say today, but I'm not directly going to be engaging with psychoanalysis. But just to start to say the obvious point about Freud identifying one myth, and organizing the whole history of the whole structure of the psyche in Western civilization around the Oedipus myth. And you'll know also Jung's work with myths and archetypes, that myth has always been central to psychoanalysis. And my earlier work with myth challenged the kind of univocal approach that psychoanalysis, especially Freudian psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis, took to myth by identifying just one myth, Oedipus, and structuring the Western psyche around that one myth. And so what my early work wanted to do was to open up the sort of mythical body or corpus, to try and think about other structures that might have been left out because of this kind of identification of one particular telling of the myth that Freud did. And so that leads to the way in which my approach to myth is like, it's like the mycelium, the fungal networks that actually Freud described in the interpretation of dreams. He said that at the point of every dream, there's an unplumbable point, a blind spot, which means that you can never arrive at a definitive truth. Like however much you interpret something, you will always come up against the blind spot. And he called that the navel of the dream. And he said at that point, at the navel of the dream, sprouts up a kind of endless network of fungi, of mycelium, which I think is a beautiful metaphor to think about what myth is like, because it's a bit like what Derrida described in his essay Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, of a structure without a center. And that's how I see myth, as a kind of organic, mutable, mycelium type root that spreads out everywhere, that is structural, but lacks not lacks, I mean, it's not a lack, it doesn't operate according to needing to have a central telos or nucleus, or, you know, the notion of a center. It's a structure without a center, which I think is a beautiful way of visualizing how myth works. So I come to your conference not with film at the moment, although the Telling Tales project is a video project, so it speaks to the audio visual. But I come to your conference with the notion of transmission, which I think the conference is engaged with. So the way I understand myth is as a, like I've said, as a mycelium of mutable meanings and structures, which have been recycled throughout time. And in each retelling, something new happens. So I think Hannah Arendt once said, in each new birth, there's a new possibility of a whole future, you know, it's a really optimistic idea. But I feel like in each retelling of these stories, there's a possibility of a new future opens up. And I think that's why telling and retelling myths and fairy tales is essentially, by definition, a political act. It's also the par excellence, the kind of death of the author. You know, there was never any author of myths. It's by definition a polyphonic, multifarious, mutable authorship, which has been to do with a kind of recycling, and in each retelling something new happens and also something is left out. So my sense is that when we retell myths, not only do we make possible a new future, but we also at the same time foreclose a future, because in each telling you tell one thing, you don't tell another thing. So the infinite amount of retellings is a kind of crucial practice that we have as a species been doing since the beginning of time. So these stories endure. And many people have asked, why do these stories endure? And it's a question that we can inexhaustibly ask, and in the same way that myth itself is an inexhaustible body movement of meaning. And so my question is, what gets transmitted in each retelling? And that's what my work is all about. So in my early work, I refuted Freudian kind of fetishization of Oedipus and opened up psychoanalysis, I hope, to different myths in order to unlock other psychic structures that might help us think about a new symbolic order and a new way of thinking and being in the world. So the other thing I wanted to say about myths is that there's a paradox that I'm very interested in, which is, on the one hand, things like psychoanalysis and myself and many people who've written on myths and fairy tales are interested in psychology, are interested in the internal conflicts of the human mind and emotional life. But my feeling about myth is that one of the reasons why it endures is because of what Walter Benjamin called its compact chasteness. Chasteness, I don't know if that does that translate? So compact chasteness, meaning like virginity. It's weird. It's a strange word that he used. But I think it's about distilled purity is how I would kind of understand compact chasteness. I can't say the word chasteness properly, but I think it's interesting to think about what compact chasteness or distilled purity might mean in relation to myth. And paradoxically, for those of us interested in the unconscious and in psychology and in the internal world, it means a lack of psychology. And I'd want to just say something about that quickly, that that one of the reasons why myth is so powerful, and I'm including fairy tale too. So it's like oral traditions which persist and get recycled down the centuries in all different cultural contexts, so that they become a kind of synchronic structural transmission that kind of comes through us, but in each retelling we pick up something contextual which changes the meaning. But the anti-psychology part of the movement of myth is something that really interests me, because if you think yourselves about characters you might have identified with or liked as a child, I don't know in Spain if we share many of the same fairy tales, Snow White, Red Riding Hood, Helen of Troy, all the Greek myths, that we can, as children and adults, we can have a strange sense of intimacy with these characters. It's almost as if when you're being told the story, like say of Snow White, that you feel like you know Snow White intimately. Well, I feel that. I don't know whether you share that there's a strange intimacy with these characters, much more so than any characters that I've ever experienced in novels or films or other literary genre. That there's something about these big, and I don't think it's archetypal either, because that is a whole different paradigm, but there's something about the fact that we can feel an intimacy with these characters. But my point is that they're not characters. And that is part of the compact chasteness of the transmission of myth, that the minutime micro psychology is literally shed down to the bare bones or the armature of what's important, like this compact chasteness. I mean, I guess Lacanians would call it structural, and I would call it structural too. But there's something important about the fact that we don't know how Snow White, for example, feels. She doesn't feel like sad or lonely or abandoned. We don't think of her in terms of her emotional repertoire. We think of her as a more phenomenological sort of what's the word, like a model or something, a structure, yet we feel intimate with her. And I think that's the thing I want to stay with myth, that it can transmit this feeling of both intimacy and a kind of impersonality, like an anti-psychological structure of meaning, so that we're not interested in feelings, emotions, or whether she felt abandoned or any kind of that sort of level of individual micro personal emotional life. But we can feel intimacy with them, with these characters structurally. And I guess it's worth mentioning that Greek tragedy, which is another form, the ancient Greek tragedy, which is another form that's obviously directly related to myth, the masked characters, it's an obvious point to say that having the mask on, it's funny, we're talking about masks in the pandemic, and actually it did occur to me that everyone with masks on becomes a kind of position in a constellation, but their internal psychology is kind of shed for the moment. And so I think this idea of the anti-individual, if you see what I mean, it's very hard to theorize it, but I do believe that this compact chasteness that Benjamin identified in myth and fairy tale, which partly explains their endurability, is to do with this shedding of the sort of quotidian psychology, which is a relief. So it has a kind of impersonality, and yet it draws us in on an intimate level by distilling the experience of love, hate, power, violence, kinship, those kind of huge things, but without the sort of feeling. So it's, in a way, it's quite a harsh, is harsh the right word? It has a brutality to it, in that it positions these characters just in terms of a kind of phenomenological structure of what they do and the conflicts that they face, not what they feel, yet somehow the distillation of that allows us to feel. It's a bit like what Freud experienced when he saw Oedipus. He was like, we are all a little Oedipus. But the problem with Freud is that we are all much more than a little Oedipus. And the last thing to say about myth is that it's never ending and inexhaustible. So that once you think you've got to the grips of the myth, you haven't, because it's always changing into something else, because it does not follow the logic of beginning, middle, and end. It's like the movement of something which has never been itself. There is no origin and there is no end. It's like the mycelium, or it's like the octopus that changes into anything that it touches. It's constant. As soon as you think you've got it, it shifts and turns into something else. And so the infinite number of retellings and variants of a myth is part of the power of its transmission, that there can never be a definitive truth. And so coming back to the navel of the dream that Freud identified, in a sense, the navel of the mythical body is where all the mushroom and all the mycelium and all the meaning sprouts up. So that's how I place myself, in the middle of a huge mycelium network of meanings. I hope that wasn't a too long introduction about just telling you how I see myth. So in the pandemic, I'm going to just talk about what happened in relation to myth and the pandemic for me. We were all, as you know, stuck in our houses, working online and doing research. And then part of me, my relationship to myth changed in terms of the kinds of transmission that I felt was necessary in our contemporary times. And rather than writing academic articles or books on myth, which I have done, and identifying parts of myths which have been left out and trying to add them to our cultural imaginary in order to open up new futures, I decided that the academic context just and wasn't the right thing at the moment, and that what I wanted to do was to be part of the actual practice, the performative practice of retelling myths as an act, as a phenomenological performative act, which was also by definition audio visual. So now we're all sitting here on Zoom, and all of you, I'm sure, like myself, have had to be teaching on Zoom and doing everything on Zoom. And I found myself quite intuitively going out into my garden, which is I don't know, I'm lucky to have a garden, but to be in nature, which is to have the backdrop of the kind of something organic and growing, but also changing with the seasons. So a bit like myth, in a way, that myth I feel is an organic thing, which is always growing and dying and being reborn again in each retelling. And that what I wanted to do was to tell tales that I felt that was poignant to our contemporary time. So going back to the oral traditions and retelling in this moment, in order to try and think about the possibility of each story opening up a possibility of a new future, like Hannah Arendt said about each new birth. And so that's what I did. But I wanted to say one thing about that, is that rather than editing, rather than thinking about the myth first and like writing something out and editing it, what I wanted to do was to involve myself in the actual practice of a spontaneous storytelling tradition that wasn't to do with editing or writing down or thinking about what should come first. And so it was like I mean, I hope it's not grandiose to say that it was like an art project, but it did feel like I was making some kind of different format for my interest in myth. And so I went into the garden spontaneously and sat there and pressed and used Zoom, which is what we're all using, and then retold a myth in a spontaneous way with commentary, but not commentary in an academic way, just a sort of like a dream, a sort of like telling a dream with associations and the story all at the same time. And then made a video, and I've made a YouTube channel of just of lots of different fairy tales and myths as an act of a sort of political, I think, retelling of all the myths that I feel intuitively as well are important for us to sort of rebirth in this difficult time that we're all living. So that was the and I called it Telling Tales, and I'm not sure whether in Spain the phrase translates, but it's a double meaning, obviously. So if you tell a tale, it's like you're lying, you're telling an untruth, but it's also telling tales means telling stories. And that's what I wanted to identify, that some of what we've received, like a lot of my work is to do with how we have received myths from the past in transgenerationally, that have told a story and opened up a possibility, but at the same time have concealed a story. And in that sense, a story is always telling a tale, it's telling a lie as well as telling a truth. And in a way, that's what's so compelling about the oral tradition. So, for example, something about telling a myth that we receive that tells a lie, that's what structures the argument of my book on matricide, that the Western culture has received the image of Athena as being the motherless daughter, the daughter that was born from the head of Zeus. I don't know if everyone is familiar with that myth, but she's a parthenogenetic creation which explodes out of the father's head, and she was, of course, Freud's favorite. He had a little statue of her, and he said she is perfect, which indicates his interest in the sort of father's daughter idea, and the kind of matricidal sort of origin of Athena. But interestingly, when you research the myth of Athena, and it doesn't take a lot, you just read around, there's so many available different stories and variants of that myth. In Hesiod, it's there. It's not like Freud would have had to look for it hard, but he didn't see it, or he chose not to retell it. In the same way that the whole of Western culture kind of seemed to collaborate with this lie, I would say, of Athena not having a mother, because Athena has a mother. and it's told in many different myths. And her name is Metis. And she was an ancient goddess who Zeus raped and swallowed and impregnated. So she is the mother of Athena, but he swallows her up in order to appropriate and steal her reproductive generativity, so that he becomes mother, he becomes the one that gives birth through his head. And interestingly, Metis is also the name for a model of knowledge, which was very to do with a much more intuitive philosophy of way of knowing. That's another thing to talk about another time, but that she represents an epistemology which is to do with mutable meanings and shiftingness and cunning. It's called cunning intelligence, and it's linked to Metis, Athena's mother. And what happens in the retellings of the myth, not just by Freud, but by centuries of people and retellings, is that Metis gets locked inside Zeus's stomach, and we all just carry on thinking that Athena had no mother, and in so doing we reproduce a certain vision of culture. So I think it's so political when in the Oresteia trilogy Athena says herself, "I am not born of woman," because actually she is. And so in each retelling, to open up Athena's relationship to her mother Metis, and what Metis represents in terms of an alternative epistemology and way of knowing, is already a kind of intervention. So that's what I mean about telling tales, that as we tell a story, we're always already not telling another story, because you can't tell everything, and also obviously there's ideological forces that would have liked Athena to be born out of the head of Zeus. She was born out of the head of Zeus, but she was conceived and did have a mother. So I think that's very significant. Sorry, how much time have I got, Ivan? Have I been?
You have still a lot of time. It's just 10:30, so
Okay. So now I think what I'd like to do is to talk about, I've already explained why telling tales is telling lies, telling myths, and retellings are telling lies by definition, and opening up new possibilities for new futures. I've talked about one birth, the birth of Athena, which I've tried to explain was not the birth it was the birth out of the head, but there was a conception that's been written out of Western culture, and to bring back Metis is a political act which opens up a new future. So as I was sitting in my garden, wanting to retell myths, I want to say one more thing about the form of that it is audiovisual. So I was using Zoom, and I can show you, or Ivan can later, the YouTube channel. But what I was committed to was the formal structure of the one take. So I wouldn't let myself edit, because what I'm interested in is the oral tradition of retelling. It's a praxis, it's a practice, and it's phenomenological rather than analytic in a way, and it's also associative, in like the dream is. So that I put the video on and told the tale as I wanted to tell it and as it came. And sometimes in the act of telling, I would realize something about the tale that would be spontaneous. And so there was something about the spontaneity of telling that allows for association in the unconscious, and the absolute refusal of edit means that you're doing like a one take, like a visual, like a long shot, as it were, in visually. And so that was very important to me in the form, so that the telling tales was not an academic piece of work. It was an experimental, and it continues to be. I'm going to carry on doing it as long as there are myths, but that it's an experimental sort of practice whereby the myth comes through with all the influences, but the trust is in the one take. And so that's why I identify this project as a project which has a formal rationale, that it's distinct from academic work on myth. It's literally the retelling. So I'd love it if you could look at my YouTube channel to see whether it does open up something, not just in terms of the content of what I'm saying, but the form of the videos. It's really important to me. Maybe we can talk about that later. So just to end, I thought that given that I'm talking about the retelling of myth as birthing, the possibility of birthing a future which doesn't yet exist, and also telling tales by definition foreclosing something that doesn't exist, I wanted to end with another birth. And so I've talked about Athena's birth. I wanted to talk about the birth of Venus, which I'm sure we all know in some form or another. In terms of this myth of the birth of Venus. And I'll be quick, just wanted to show you the kinds of things that interest me about this. So if you think of your own associations to the myth of the birth of Venus, I mean, many people firstly will go to the Botticelli painting, where Venus stands in the centerpiece. I should have got an image, but I didn't want to share my screen because everything would probably go wrong at that point. But we can imagine anyway that the visual motif that's probably really strong in all of our minds is Venus standing in the center with the beautiful, still, calm sea, and she's standing in the oyster shell. And there's some characters next to her that are blowing winds, but generally it's a completely still, beautiful. Like there's a kind of dead calm to it. It's really calm, and then this figure in the center, Venus Aphrodite, rising from the sea, fully formed, and this is this kind of extraordinary birth of Venus, of love, of the goddess of love, Aphrodite. Now, I'm not sure if anyone, you may know this, but it's interesting the way it's definitely left out in most versions, and certainly in the Botticelli painting. There's no sense that anything violent happened before. But I want to tell you about the birth of Venus, and because it will explain, it will bring together everything I hope that I've been saying this morning. So I'm going into my telling tales mode now. So just enjoy the story. So the sky god called Uranus and Gaia, Mother Earth. So this is how the myth starts, a creation myth. And Uranus, the sky god, is impregnating Gaia, penetrating her relentlessly, and not giving her a break at all. So it's this image of a kind of coercive, relentless penetration of Mother Earth, and she's conceiving babies all of the time inside her body, but he won't get off her. He won't let the babies out, and he won't let them deliver. He's just literally forcing her into an eternal, perpetual coitus, intercourse, penetration, and conceiving babies. It's a really disturbing image. And Gaia, Mother Earth, is had enough. She's like, after a while, this is intolerable. And so she calls to one of her other sons who have been released into the world, Saturn, Kronos, representing of time, and throws him an instrument, a knife or whatever, like a sharp instrument. And she says to her son, please castrate Uranus, get him off me. So the mother appeals to the son to castrate the father. Now, this is a castration which Freud never spoke about. He was very interested in castration in relation to the Oedipus myth, but he seemed to strangely miss this out. Someone who was so obsessed with castration as the central bedrock of his theory, and Lacan, they missed out this incredible, like, uber castration at the beginning of ancient Greek culture. So the son, Kronos, gets hold of the instrument and he castrates Uranus, and he gets him off his mother. And then he takes the genitals of Uranus, the sky god, and he throws them into the sea. And the sea bubbles up, boils up like an alchemical sort of explosion. And then out comes Venus Aphrodite. But we only ever hear of the rising up of Venus Aphrodite in the the oyster shell, we don't often get told the violent beginnings, the castration which produced her. and I think that's just absolutely fascinating, that there's this a very different model of desire here, and that love, she's the goddess of love, is born out of an act of violence and castration of a rapist father, actually, a coercive rapist father who won't leave the earth alone. You know, so I really feel like this is a myth about the environment as well. Like if you think of Gaia, mother, the earth goddess in this myth, as being not just a figure, like a mother figure, but also the earth, this idea of this kind of coercive abuse to the mother earth, that something needs to happen, and it's also related to the birth of a new form of love. So that this castration of Uranus, of the sky god, it's like a severance, it's like a saying no more, like a limit, a change, and then this throwing out into the sea, into the ocean, of the genitals of the sky god, and it mixes together with the water of the sea to produce Venus Aphrodite. We have this extraordinary model of love. So my question is, in retelling this myth, why is it also that we are so, as a culture, I mean, I know we have lots of different cultures, but the sort of visual motif of love, which comes down the generations, Eros, is of this little baby boy. And Freud was very interested in Eros, as you know, and our culture is very interested in Eros, the little baby boy, as representing love and desire. And I've always wondered myself, why is a baby representing sort of sexual desire and love, when we have Venus Aphrodite, a kind of adult woman as well, as a model of love, but also who's born out of this extraordinary castration of the sky god, in order to preserve the dignity of Mother Earth. And that the birth of Venus is much more than just this calm, beautiful woman arising from nowhere in the sea. That she is a transgressive love by definition, because she's born of a castration, a protest, a saying, no, this is enough, we cannot go on like this. So I wanted to say that retelling Venus in our times not only allows us to move from the fetishization of the baby boy representing love to the mature woman, but it also speaks to our relationship to the earth, and a saying no, a castration, a severance of a certain relationship we have to the earth, which is abusive, and to throw the remnants of that abusive power into the sea to produce something else. So in the retelling, I hope that we get a new birth of Venus, a new birth of model of love we could think about, as well as a new relationship to the earth. So I think I'll probably end there in just saying that in each retelling, like, images and ideas and different futures can be released, and it's a matter of how we receive the stories and then retell them ourselves in our own particular context. So thank you very much for letting me share my current work, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Septiembre. It was absolutely fascinating. We could listen to you retelling those myths, like this Venus myth, for hours and hours, I think. And it's a wonderful performance of the myth, and we were all inside this birth of Venus at this moment. So maybe we need more in that sense. So I would like to open the possibility to make questions or comments by all people here. So I don't know, because I know that there are some researchers working particularly in that way. I'm thinking, for example, of Edurne, that is working in that, retelling the myth, and also the gender in a gender question. So I open the possibility. I don't know if some of you want to ask something, or I have a lot of questions, but I prefer opening the micro.
I have a question, Ivan.
Please.
Can you listen to me?
Yeah.
When you invite somebody, it's always nice that there are questions. So I'm gonna pose one. You said at some point, Amber, that myths do not necessarily follow the logic of beginning, middle, and end, which is something that I think we can all agree. And I was thinking, are there any examples of works, they could be films or anything else, that you think that have misinterpreted that perhaps try to sort of, let's say, tame or compress that freedom of the myths or that multiplicity or that plurality, and they try to sort of like pack them, structure them, and monetize them to us? I don't want you to like just do a negative critique, but I guess for all of us, and I haven't read your book. I will, but I haven't. So it would be helpful also to know if there are some uses of the myth, contemporary uses of the myth, that you find not so interesting, or that you think they miss the point, or that they just try to squeeze money by structuring those materials.
No, thanks. That's a really good question. Well, I think that there's no value judgment for me on the amount of retellings that happen, because I think one of the properties of myth is that it's like the wish of the myth is to be retold, and so people are going to retell them. If you look at even things like contemporary sort of video games, you know, they're full of association to myths, and or even like Disney fairy tale, for example, like, because I'm also really interested in fairy tale. So the way that Disney will tell a story, or the way that you know. So what I'm trying to say is that you can't ever represent the truly open-ended properties of myth, because it defies telling. That's what's so amazing, is that that's what I was trying to say, is that when you tell a myth, you're also not telling something, because you can't tell. It's like Levi-Strauss called myth like an orchestral score. It's like you're hearing a kind of cacophony of different variants which are inexhaustible. So what tends to happen, like with Freud's a good example of just taking Oedipus and taking one very narrow telling of Oedipus, like leaving out Antigone, for example, of the Oedipus myth. So even within his retelling of Oedipus, he forgot Antigone, who's really integral to the Oedipus myth, and Jocasta, you know, like he told it in a very particular way, obviously for sort of ideological reasons, which maybe were unconscious to him, but also because we can't actually tell it all. So it's not that I think that there's anything wrong with contemporary with cultures like honing in onto some aspect of a myth and retelling it and trying to give it a structure and give it a definitive meaning, if we're aware that each retelling is like a shard or a fragment, and that it can never ever, it only tells us what it's not telling us, then if we collect them all up, that's when we get to the spirit of myth. So even when I'm retelling it myself, that's just what I'm doing in relation to my own cultural moment and my own unconscious and all sorts of things. It's not definitive either. So I'm also telling a tale, as in telling a lie, and because we can't help but want to produce a beginning, middle, and end as well. But I think what has to happen is that there has to just be a knowledge of each retelling as being valuable shard of an inexhaustible puzzle that never ends. And so it's not a matter of saying someone did it, even though I'm critical of the way in which Oedipus was recycled with Freud, because it was just left out everything else so massively. So I think isolating a myth can be a kind of violence in that it forecloses other meanings. But rather than just critiquing, it's what I want to do now is to just see it as part of the movement of myth. And so all you have to do as a scholar or as someone who lives myth is is look at what myths are circulating in the contemporary and then just add to them as a practice. So in each retelling, even telling to children or telling whatever, like in your actual life, to tell is to automatically critique other people's telling, but also not just negatively, it just adds to them and proliferates the inexhaustible field of myth. So I don't know if that helps, but yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amber. Thank you, Manuel. Laura, please.
Hi. Thank you. First of all, Amber, thank you for being here. I was in one of your courses back in 2014 when I did my master's at Birbeck.
Oh,
so
wow.
it's great to have you, to hear you again. I want what you were speaking a lot about the political retelling of the myths. I was thinking about Zizek's retelling of Antigone in this film, How Dare We? I don't know if you're familiar with it.
What's the film?
Antigone, How Dare We? And Zizek, it's in it, and it's kind of a film about the triple life of Antigone in his work, and how he so his point is that Antigone, put in the actual political context and the current political context of the US, how Antigone, as the defendant of the ethical and the just beyond the law, would be in favor of closing the borders to immigrants in Europe. And I was interested, I don't know if you're familiar with the film. It's okay, it's interesting. And I was thinking about what you were saying about how these retellings of the myths work to create possible futures.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think if there's actually an opposition between taking the current political situation or current ideology and working it into the myth, or the other way around, if there's a difference between these two things, and if this affects how we can think about these possible futures.
Yeah, that's a really
I hope I made sense. I don't know, maybe it didn't make sense.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I don't know the film, but were you saying also that the myth was being used for you know, from what I get from what you're saying also is that, maybe I'm misread, tell me if this doesn't make sense, but I think the other thing about myth, which is quite potentially wild, is how it can get used. So, like, for example, using Antigone to talk about the need to close borders, it's like it's which so it could be used for all political means. Is that what you mean, that you can't kind of control how the myth is used? It can be used in a reactionary way, and it can be used in a, so it's beyond. But what I think about that is that absolutely that how these myths are used is not the myth. The body of myth doesn't care, and it actually, so it's got this kind of immoral movement myth. It's like this relentless storytelling that you can tell in so many different ways. So the Antigone myth, for example, so many people have worked on Antigone and reproduced it to mean different things. It's been especially that myth, because it had such a political reach, you know, like manifestly. But the context in which that can happen is not controllable. It's like the movement of yeah, it's a different kind of epistemology where it gives you all of this movement and mechanism, but the way it's going to get used is open. But I think what we have to, so I'm not sure if I'm answering you correctly, but it's like the contemporary, I think the contemporary moment is always desiring myth, and myth is always desiring to go into the contemporary moment, but how it happens is so radically open that it's a kind of risk, and that you, I don't know if I've answered you properly, sorry, but that's really interesting about the film as well. I don't know, did I answer you, or do you want to say something else back about that?
No, that's fine. I'll share the title of the film on the chat, so you can check it. I think it's interesting how how we can, as you said, how we can explore the myths in the sense that it represents our ideology, but also to make sense of that ideology, right? When you retell.
Yeah, exactly. So you retell in order to deconstruct on the one hand, but on the other hand, you retell to birth a new future, but you might not necessarily know what that new future is, because the whole point of the future is that you can't know it. But that in each retelling, you are looking back by definition because you're receiving it, but you're also looking forward just in the act of telling. But yeah, you can't control what that opening might lead to, sort of thing. Don't know if that makes sense. Like, for example, the Venus thing, like it only occurred to me when I was retelling it quite recently that it's also about the environment, you know, like seeing Uranus and Gaia as, you know, seeing that myth not just about love and about intervening on a gender level, about why moving from the little boy to the adult woman as a model of mature love in our culture, but also it's about the environment. It's about saying no to a kind of abusive relation to the earth. But I didn't really know I thought that until I said that. So I was kind of looking back and then looking forward, and it's that double movement that myth asks of us in each retelling. But sorry if I've gone off subject.
No, not at all.
Thank you.
That's very interesting.
Nice to see you again as well.
Thank you very much, Amber. Thank you, Laura. I don't know if there are more questions. Just time for this last question. Laia, please. Thanks.
Hello. It was very interesting, and I was just curious because I work for a subject about media and motherhood, and about what you've just said about the Metis. And it's interesting, at least I think it is, how different figures of Greek tragedy that are mothers and that have been kind of silenced for being mothers and having Metis, like Medea or even, you know, Clytemnestra. Yeah. And in cinema, for instance, in contemporary cinema, I worked on Hereditary, Aster. The American film.
Yeah,
it is still a bit confusing and a bit like open-ended, as you said, because I feel like there's still a need like to understand these myths, and maybe Metis is a central part of it, to revalue motherhood and to really understand like what is going on today, because it doesn't fit maybe Metis with the archetype of motherhood that is still being trying to be like institutionalized. So it was really, really great because yeah, I think it's Metis, as you said, no, it's another kind of intelligence, another more intuitive intelligence that is maybe what could be proposed from a more even feminist, but also from motherhood theories. So it's interesting. And thank you very much.
No, that's a really interesting question, and I've done a lot of work on Clytemnestra and Medea, mothers in myth as well. So yeah, if you wanted to talk at a later date about that, I'd love to. But I think you're absolutely right that the construction of the maternal in our cultures is relentlessly binary. You know, it's either Medea, Clytemnestra, kind of like destructive phallic mothers that are seen as kind of either they're either masculinized or demonized, or there's the sort of Madonna type mother, that we're still living in a kind of old age binary in terms of the maternal, which is just so destructive in every way, because it moves from idealization to denigration, which of course is a really a kind of abusive cycle, actually, and part of misogyny. So I do believe that rereading things like Medea is crucial, and I'm so pleased that people are doing that. But I do think you're right that Metis helps, because Metis isn't just another goddess that's raped and swallowed, another mother goddess that's raped and swallowed and appropriated. But as you say, it's a form of knowledge and a form of epistemology that does not function according to binary logic. So she's truly radical and transgressive. So it's worth looking at Metis as cunning intelligence, it's called. It's a beautiful book by Jean Vernant and Marcel Detienne. it's actually, I can, it's in, Ivan, it's in that interview that that I gave you that maybe could be posted, that there's a reference to a book, a beautiful book by two French classicists on Metis as cunning intelligence, as a philosophical system. And I've written myself in how we might want to think about that alternative way of knowing in relation to the maternal, to try and intervene into this horrifically violent binary representation of the maternal. So I think you're right to identify Metis as the thing which could break down that construction and bring Medea and Clytemnestra to life in a different way. I've got a video on Clytemnestra, on the sacrifice of Iphigenia, on the Telling Tales website, and also about Demeter, to try precisely to sort of rework the maternal outside the binary misogynist logic of idealization or denigration on the one hand. So yeah, I'm really interested to follow up your work as well on that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amber. Thank you, Laia. And Edurne, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you if you think that in those retelling of the myths can sometimes lose its essence, like maybe not being that particular myth anymore, or that every single time a myth it's been retold, it's part of like that universe. I don't know if it makes sense.
No, that is a really interesting question, because weirdly, like when Walter Benjamin calls myth like compact chasteness, it assumes like that there's an essence of that structure of that myth, but at the same time there are so many infinite variants of those myths that they're always slightly different. So what happens to the essence, and are you diluting something as you retell it? It's a really interesting question, but I do really think that's a question which I can't possibly solve here, but it's also part of the reason why they survive. Because on the one hand, there's this distilled structure which never goes. Even when you retell them a million infinite times with different endings or different beginnings or different variants, that I don't believe, weirdly, strangely, amazingly, magically even, they don't lose that compact chasteness, but they just proliferate. So I think it's a really great question, because it shows a very unique property of myth, that on the one hand, they have a distilled structure which is unshakable and undilutable, yet they can change into a million things but still retain their essence. So I think me telling the story of Clytemnestra and Iphigenia, and Aeschylus telling it, sorry to be grandiose to include me in that tradition, but I think we have to bash down hierarchies now, that the essence of the myth remains, but it exudes something else as well. So I think that's the way I would answer it, that it's not either compact chasteness and homogeneous structure or heterogeneous dilution. It's both. It's as if like something is distilled, but by definition, there's always going to be a proliferation. I don't know if I've answered that properly, but I think your question is philosophically key and really, really interesting, and identifies what's unique about myth, that relationship to essence and structure and constant mutability and change and transformation. So I think you've kind of nailed it in terms of describing the paradox of myth and its retelling. So thanks for that question.
Thank you again. Thank you very much, Amber. Thank you, Edurne. We have to close this amazing talk. I think I have the sensation that we could go on the whole morning talking about myths and talking about this idea of retelling the myth. For me, I'm very happy with this talk, especially Amber, because in our department always has coexisted two ways of explaining and dealing with transmission. No? On one hand, the way more related to iconology, iconography, the work of A.B. Warburg, no? all this tradition more formal, about gestures, but on the other hand, the Jungian, the Campbellian tradition,
Right.
this way of approaching to the myth, not just in psychological terms, but as Walter Benjamin told in his writings about childhood, no, when he talked about the epic wisdom, this other way of knowledge that opens new possibilities for futures, as you said. Thank you very much for this beautiful, incredible talk for us.
It's a pleasure. It was great to be with you, and the questions were really wonderful and really enriched my thinking. So I'm so happy you invited me, and I hope you'll enjoy my YouTube channel. It's going to go on forever, as long as there are stories, but it's going to go on. But I've really enjoyed it. I wish I could stay for the rest of the conference, but I have to be elsewhere. But I've really enjoyed it, and I'm really grateful to have been invited. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amber. I have put the link to your YouTube channel in order to share with all the people here and all the people at the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and yeah, I hope to work with you all again soon.
See you soon.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.